Lazard, who's been with you for a long time, and Artisan, who's been around for a somewhat shorter time period. And we think that the allocation there to emerging markets is appropriate. Order of the 9 S&P market is capitalization is in emerging markets, and that's right about where we are. So we've talked about allocations to managers. On the next slide, we have allocations in terms of their styles. On slide 10, this is a holding space style analysis. So you look at the underlying characteristics of price earnings ratios, capitalizations, and things such as that, in order to come up with this chart. And you can see that style is measured on the horizontal axis with value to the left and growth to the right. Capitalization is measured on the vertical axis from micro all the way up to mega cap. And we like this structure because you have managers in every capitalization area, from small to mid and large. You have some exposures to growth and value, but are generally averaged out to core, which we think is a good thing. We don't think that over the long term, either value or growth outperforms, so we like to see a net exposure that's core-like. And if you look in the middle, the light blue box with next to the light blue rectangle there, or square there, is your total portfolio allocation. And you can see that it's right next to the ACWI US IMI dot there, the dark blue. And that's great. We think that you're well allocated, or you're approximately allocated to the styles and capitalizations that the overall marketplace. That's appropriate, because that allows your active managers to add value, and then if they do, they won't underperform because of the biases. So we looked at assets that you have allocated among managers. We looked at the general style allocation. I'm going to then break down the evaluation of the managers into the various sectors in which they manage. But before I do that, are there any questions about the overall structure?
You said total portfolio, you meant of the national?
Yes, sir. Yes. Yeah. So net of the U.S., net of the bonds. So just internet.
And these charts are similar to the ones that we showed this morning with the VC. It's the same kind of style.
So with that, as I said, I'll go through each of the areas, beginning with the large and mid-cap developed exposures. This is a style map like on the previous page, but we're looking over a longer time period. We're looking at 5 years worth of data, hence the ellipses that capture all the exposures to both styles and to capitalization. Also notice that you'll see that next to your manager names, we have the word composite. In order to get a longer period of data to look at how these managers have gone beyond what they've managed just for PERS, to look at their track record prior to even the times that they've managed for PERS, just to, like I said, get a sense of what they've done over a longer time period.
Jim, can you spend just 1 second, because this use of these ellipses is probably not something that we spend a lot of time on. Could you just explain the difference, the significance and the size of the ellipse and the location, that sort of thing, what they're depicting?
Yeah, I would say that if you look at the leader lines that go to the boxes that designate what each of these ellipses represent, that's the center of the ellipse is where the leader line ends, and that would be kind of the average exposure for this manager over that time period. So the EFA index is pretty much pegged. It has the blue ellipse. It's pretty much pegged right at core and right at large cap, as you'd expect. And the ellipse itself represents about 2/3 of the data points that we recorded over this 5-year time horizon. And the reason for 2/3 is that's plus or minus less than deviation. So the more that a manager varies in terms of style or capitalization, the larger the ellipse will be. And the converse is also true. The less that they vary from their style and capitalization, the smaller it will be. So for example, New Star varies more in style than DFA. They tend to be a core-oriented manager, but they've shown some growth characteristics over recent periods, as opposed to DFA, which has a relatively small ellipse centered on value, so they tend to be just a little more or just a little less valuable. So we like the diversification that's in this style. One thing I should point out is we have the EFA index pointed out in order to avoid redundancy and make the chart a little bit clearer. We did put BlackRock in there so it's a here of the EFA index. So that's your passive exposure there. So again, we like the passive exposure. We like the exposure to growth managers and value managers and core manager. We think they are generally good active managers for each of these positions. So the characteristics of the portfolio are good. As we look at slide 12, now we're into performance rather than characteristics. Excuse me, the risk on the bottom is measured by standard deviation, and excess return as measured by return in excess of the 3-year Treasury bill. And so what we're looking at is the returns of these managers versus the risk that they take on. And we really want to do this on a relative basis, which is why we have the EFA index as kind of the medium blue ellipse, and our core equity style group as the dark blue ellipse. And in some ways, it's hard to differentiate between the two. So the average active manager has excess returns and volatilities that are similar to the index. I think what's distinguishing about your portfolio are both DFA and Jarislowsky-Frazier. DFA tends to vary more in volatility than their peers and in the index, but because the ellipse has points that are higher than the ellipses of the peers and of the index, they've added value by taking on that variation. Conversely, Jarislowsky, with the kind of the goldenrod ellipse there, has added about the same amount of value as the managers in our international style group, but because the ellipse is to the left of the style group and to the left of the index, they've done so by taking on less risk. So that's also possible. And then New Star is right about in the middle. They look similar to the other active managers in our style. And then lastly, with large and mid cap on slide 13, we're looking at tracking error, so variability about the index that they're measured against, and alpha. And just as a reminder, the alpha is the value added after you take out the returns of the index. So if the index goes up by 10% and the active manager goes up by 12%, they have 2% alpha, the difference between their return and the return of the underlying index. So if you have an index manager, as you do, with BlackRock, they would have zero tracking error and they would have zero alpha. So they follow the index and they don't have any value over it. As you look at the ellipses here, what we can see is the core international equity tends to have the dark blue ellipse, about a 4% tracking error, and add just a little bit of value, maybe 1% over time, as we saw before, quarters of a percent. And as you see, your managers, they tend to be, Jarislowsky-Frazier tends to have about the same amount of tracking error as managers generally, but has underperformed at some points, but has more often outperformed. So the ellipse is offset up. So there's a positive value added there. New Star also is offset up in spite of the fact that they have had, in many periods, less tracking error than core international equity managers. And then finally, DFA is both offset up and has had a wide range of tracking error. But in general, your managers have had reasonable tracking error and have had added value over the index. So in summary, we would say in all of these aspects, in terms of their style, in terms of capitalization, in terms of their absolute performance, and in terms of their performance relative to the indices, these managers are doing what we think they should do in your international. we move to small cap on slide 14, you have the two new managers which really require that you look at composite or general historical returns of the managers that receive those of PERS. And when we do that, what we see in terms of characteristics are characteristics that are very similar to the small cap style for pyramids, and somewhat different, somewhat more value oriented for Mondrian, but not out of the realm of reasonableness, certainly around the equal small cap index. So we think they have the right capitalization and style exposures there. In terms of performance on slide 15, the ellipses again are very similar to international equity small cap managers, generally with somewhat less tracking error, which is a good thing. So we think that they're performing well on an absolute basis. And then on slide 16, on a relative basis, you see some of the reasons why we hired them. Relative to the small cap style, which has a large variation in tracking error, their tracking error tends to be more consistent. And for the tracking error they take, the ellipses are offset up, so they've added value relative to the index, and also relative to notice that since the centers of their ellipses are above those of the international small cap style, they've added value relative to other active managers. So good choices, again, in terms of capitalization. They're where they should be. They diversify each other. They add, on an absolute return basis, they're doing well on a relative return basis. On slide 17, we look at the last set of managers, and that's emerging markets managers. In this first slide, we're looking at 9.5 years of data, so no there, but Artisan, even with their composite record, has less of a track record than 9.5 years. And so we'll see them on a subsequent slide with a shorter track record. But since we had the longer term data for Lazard, we wanted to show that. And you can see that they are core oriented, mid-cap oriented, which is consistent with both the index and the style. One question that we often get is something that's I guess some surprise, is the mid-cap orientation of emerging markets managers. I think people tend to think of emerging markets as being, because the economies are smaller, that the capitalizations of the stocks that are traded in those economies are smaller. That's clearly not the case. And when you think about some of the stocks that are in the emerging markets index, you can see why Samsung in Korea is in the emerging markets. So Petrobras in Brazil in the emerging markets index. China Mobile, this is a relatively large cap stock that's in this index. So there are larger cap stocks as well as small cap stocks in the emerging markets index, which is why it comes out overall as a mid-cap. As I mentioned before, the short time horizon for Artisan leaves us with less data to evaluate, but nonetheless, you can see that with the small ellipse as a function of that smaller amount of data, that Artisan is close to both peers and the emerging markets index, so they're not wildly different in terms of either capitalization or style. So in terms of performance, again, we divvy this up in terms of to look at Lazard over a longer time period first. And we can see that they're consistent with both standard deviations, so absolute volatility, and they've added some value, some excess return relative to both the index and the peers, because the ellipses of life for Lazard is above both of those other areas. And then on slide 20, we're still looking at absolute return, or absolute return measures, so standard deviation, absolute volatility, and excess return. Lazard, over the most recent 2 years of rolling 3-year data, has shown less absolute risk and has added value in that time period relative to both the index and peers. And notice the peers over this time period have tended to have somewhat more volatility than the index. Artisan has experienced more volatility, but still added value relative to some value relative to the index. And then finally, on a relative basis, We're looking again at tracking errors, so volatility around the index and alpha value added relative to the index. And Lazard, over its 9.5-year history, has added significant alpha, about 3%, without taking on much more tracking error than emerging markets managers capture. And finally, on slide 22, we're looking at the shorter time frame so we can include Artisan. Lazard has had more tracking error over this time period, as we saw from a lot of that's on the previous slide. That's not unusual for them, and they've added value of doing it. And Artisan, their index is somewhat, they have as much tracking error as the index over some time periods, but in most time periods they have less tracking error relative to the index, and they've added some value. So again, to summarize, we think that the active managers that we have are in the right positions. They're doing a good job, both in terms of controlling risk and adding value. So we generally like the active managers that we have. We think that the way in which they're structured, the way in which they're combined, is generally an effective way because you have the passive exposure to the large and mid-cap area where there is less opportunity to add value. You have a good, solid, dedicated exposure to both small cap and mid-cap stocks. And the only thing that we might have you consider is maybe revisiting the regional mandates because they have limits to their effectiveness. And maybe examining having active managers that have more latitude to move between developed markets.
If there are any questions, we're happy to address them again. This is really a framework for a more detailed discussion on individual managers and primarily the regional mandates that we'll have at the next meeting. Once we're going to be looking for sources of funds for this new global manager that we'll be hiring. So all of that will be discussed at the December meeting in detail. We'll be bringing some recommendations at that time. So if there are any questions about the work that's been done, I think I know you spent a minute working through this.
I hate to ask you this after a minute's passed, but you said we might look at the regional mandates, and then we also might look at the area of the latitude. That piece, would you say that again for me?
Yeah, sure. Your overall, no, I mean, that's a great question, because your overall index is this all-country world ex-US IMI, so small cap index. And the way that the structure is currently constructed is that you have all the components of that, but you don't have any managers that are managing against that index as a whole. And the advantage of doing that is what you mentioned, is that they can look and they can say, in addition to picking stocks, in addition to picking countries or regions, they can say, you know what, we think emerging markets are overvalued. So we're going to emphasize, like I think I mentioned earlier, there's about 25% of world ex-US capitalization in emerging markets. So rather than having a 25% exposure, maybe we can have a 20% exposure. So we're adding value by picking stocks, we're adding value by picking regions, now we're going to add value by over or underweighting emerging markets. Or in other circumstances, they may say, well, gee, emerging markets play a great buy, and we really have some questions about developed markets because of what's going on in Europe and the recession in the United States. We really think that emerging markets are the place to add value, so maybe have 30%. And that's the notion I have in that.
But the alternative, if you didn't want to pursue, say, an active ex-US mandate, and you decided you want to get rid of the regional, then you would just reallocate among the existing structure, wherever you were underway.
In the bigger picture, and maybe not for today, is do you have any comments about our exposure to non-U.S. debt? There have been a fair amount of write-ups in the financial newspapers and so forth that non-U.S. debt in some areas may actually be any?
You have emerging market debt.
Do we have any exposure to?
We have an emerging market debt portfolio, and our core plus manager can buy sovereign, they can buy cash bonds outside of
Do
the
we
U.S.
have enough exposure in that area?
Well, probably not, and one of the quirks of non-U.S. bond markets is that we have a mandate for global bond managers. The problem that we've run across to date is that while this isn't a problem with emerging market debt managers, it is a problem with global bond managers in that they want to use derivatives for their exposure. They want credit swaps, credit default swaps, and they want to use futures. And we can't do that by statute. And so we contemplated taking language to allow for that. I have been reluctant to have to explain credit default swaps to the legislature, thinking that probably would not be something that they would embrace readily. And so the fact that managers have difficulty managing, it's more expensive to manage buying cash bonds than it is to buy these derivative instruments to substitute. So we have looked at that. We may have enough managers that can do it. We're continuing to explore that possibility. But the answer is probably, the short answer is probably no. We probably don't have that exposure. Okay, if there are no further questions, then we will break for lunch and we will get the large cap U.S. news begin at 10 o'clock.
Thank you.